Hey guys, Dr. Grimmer here. Today we're going to get started talking about copy editing. Oh, there we go. So copy editing, I'm just going to kind of introduce you to it in this section, but really, this is going to kind of remind you a little bit of the style and the grammar stuff that we really talked about at the beginning of the semester. There are people who like work as copy editors. Literally, that's all they do. They just edit other people's work. And I think it's a job that a lot of people enjoy if they are very detail oriented. And that's one thing I will say. I feel like you can be a really good copy editor if you're very, very good at paying attention to all the details. So usually at any big publication, whether it's newspaper, magazine, it could be even online publications, um, organizations will employ somebody who is a copy editor to work with the writers. Usually there's like a team, but if you're like a news, let's say you're a journalist that's been hired to work at the Capital Journal, there's probably just one copy editor for like 4 journalists. So you would probably work with the same one all the time. And it's important to note that when you're working with writers, editing is an individual trait. Like the more you practice it, the better it is, the easier it is for you to do. And the more you kind of like figure out what things to look for yourself as an editor, the easier, it will be. And you'll kind of like develop this style for editing where some things will jump out at you more quickly than it might to another person. And I think it just does take practice. Again, to me, editing is like writing. It is not a talent, but it is a skill that you have to build through practice. So one thing that you have to keep in mind is when you're editing somebody else's story, like that story a lot of times is something that they put a lot of work into. And editors have to remember that it's not a personal thing. When you're editing somebody's story, you're not editing the person, right? You're not um, working so much with the person. So you're really just trying to get their story to be the best thing that it can possibly be before it's published. Okay. So just kind of keep that in mind because if you're a copy editor, and that's your job, like you're probably going to work with some people that you don't like so much, and you're probably going to work with some writers that you really do like. That's pretty typical of any, job, like doesn't matter where it is. So keep that in mind. Like it isn't a personal thing. You're really just trying to make their story into the best version possible. So when it's published, like it'll be easily understood, people will like it, they'll share it well, and all that kind of stuff. Something we've talked about before, but I want to call back to in this class is that we do not write the way we talk. And sometimes if you're confused about what the writer was trying to say, the journalist was trying to say in a certain sentence or paragraph, it might just be easier to like actually talk to the writer and ask them like, what are you trying to say here? And then help them like maybe rewrite it and to make it more clear. I have noticed that a lot with students when I will copy edit their, stories for them. Sometimes I'll be like, I'm missing something here because I clearly don't understand this. And then I'll talk to them and they'll be like, oh yeah, I left out this like one name or I left out this word or something. And and there could be a missing piece too that just talking to them and engaging with them is going to help you figure out what it is. Um, and usually when it's like really big stories and we're talking about like um at really big publications. I mean, I doubt most like local small newspapers can really have the time to do this, but especially we're talking about like bigger publications like the Kansas City Star or something. Usually, an editor will like go through first, fix all the major glaring things, and then they'll go back through and they'll do what we call kind of like a second read with the reporter and just kind of go over like, okay, this is what we're talking about here and clarify small things that like would just not necessarily things that are wrong in the story, but things that can make the story like go to that next level, right? um Now I will say like from working with students, usually when I copy edit your pieces, I don't have the time to give everybody's piece a second read. I have way too many students. I have like 80 students a semester, 4 classes. So it's a lot of students to go through and edit all of their stuff. So typically I'll give you one copy editing, and then you could take that, I'll fix the major things, the grammar, the spelling, the style, the stuff that points out to me, even the things about clarity that I've noticed. But I won't sit down and be like, well, does this lead make more sense than that lead? That's not the kind of like level of editing I have time for. But if you're working for like a bigger publication and you're one of their like most important, let's say they're full-time journalist who is working on a really important story, you might be called in to sit down with your copy editor and do a second read. And you should look at that as like a safety net, right? Like that they are helping you to figure out how to make the story the absolute best it can be, so that when it's published, like, people want to share it. Oops, I don't know why that did that. Okay, so here's some of the things that we do when it comes to editing. Copy editors will often try and keep in mind the context for the story and for the publication. So one question that you might want to ask is, why this story and why now? Like, is there timeliness to the story? For instance, is it about something that just happened? Is it like maybe an anniversary story, 20 years after the fact? We want to talk about this again. An example of that would be in the Associated Press today, actually, which is March 27th, 2023, in case you're watching this far and you're like, where's that story? So today, actually, I saw a story about 20 years since the America went to war with Iraq, right? And they did like this kind of anniversary story saying that like now a lot of the people who like, may have been in the Senate all this time, think that like the vote that they had made back then, they would change it and it would be different because of the, false narrative of weapons of mass destruction, which, they ended up proving mostly didn't exist. I mean, there's no like absolute hard truth on that, unfortunately, but they believe that it didn't exist the way they said it did at the time. So for the Associated Press, they would have said like, hey, this story is important because we're at 20 years like this month, really, when we declared war. So it makes sense, right? There's the context. So a good editor is always going to kind of ask that, because there's some stories that like, if they wrote that story, for instance, in January, because they're trying to get ahead of things, the editor would say like, let's hold this until, March, so we can get like right on the actual anniversary of it, right? And then other times, like, could be that you've like worked really hard on this story. Let's say it's like a soft news story about a grocery store opening. And the day that it's supposed to go out, something happens and like there's a big, I don't know, earthquake, right? The editor's going to say like, we're not going to publish this story. We'll hold off on it because we need to publish all the stories about the like natural disaster. So sometimes those kinds of things will happen too. And that might, like, not to say that your story will never get published, but they might hold it for a while and say like, well, this is not as important as addressing the natural disaster. So let's just, put that to the side. So editors will often make those decisions as well. Some other questions to ask is like, who or what is benefiting from the story, who or what is harmed. It's good to know, not necessarily, even if it does, if you would say like, well, it shines a light on somebody's criminal activities, so you could say that that person's family might be harmed by this. That doesn't mean that an editor is going to say like, oh, we're not publishing it because we don't want to hurt anybody. Like, no, in that case, like that person chose to do those crimes. And so we will publish this. But for instance, if you wrote or you wanted to write a story about, let's say, something that would be considered a sensitive topic, like a 13-year-old girl was raped, probably the copy editor would say like, well, we need to report on the fact that this happened because it is official record. It's going to be in the police records, but we're not going to do things like talk about who she is, because a lot of, and it's not a law or anything, but a lot of news organizations will not name minors in news because they want to protect that minor's right to privacy. So those kinds of things will happen too. And a good copy editor will kind of ask those kinds of questions and be like, should this name be in here or not? Like, what's the point of this? Another thing that copy editors will ask is this a factual, like, statement of what's happening, but it still somehow misleads as to the real, like, the real circumstances or the real effects of what's happening. You don't want to do that, right? You don't want to mislead. And that's kind of also where being very careful about your opinion, like not to let your opinion get into your hard news stories, is really important. And a good copy editor will double check for all that stuff. So for instance, you could say like, you reported on the fact that Washburn men's basketball lost the game. And the way you write that story could be like, they worked so hard and, fell so far. Was that like an old Linkin Park song or something? But, you could write it like that, but that's kind of misleading because as a journalist, we don't want to tell people how hard they worked. We want to tell people like what they accomplished and then let people decide like, oh yeah, they did work hard, or not, right? So a good copy editor is going to look for things like that. Does the writing reflect the assignment? So not assignment as in what you were told to do by your teacher, but assignment as in the editor came to the journalist and said like, hey, I think you're really good at this type of story. I want you to go out and cover this thing. And normally journalists will have like what we call a beat. And I've talked about this a little bit before, but I'll mention it again. Journalists will have like a beat where they work on covering a certain type of content for the publication. So a really common one that just about every newspaper has is what we call like the government beat. So for the Topeka Capital Journal, it would be like the city government, right? Something, or also things that happen in the state of Kansas and even the county, like things that happen there. So they might cover like city hall meetings, or city council meetings, like the election for the new mayor, like all these kinds of things. Anytime there's like a budget increase or a budget cut to the city budget, these are the things that they would cover, right? So normally your copy editor is going to be like, is this like either something the editor personally asked you to write because of you're good at this and they know that you'll do a great job, or is this like your normal beat story? And if it's not, they'll say like, well, why? And there could be many good reasons for this. Like for instance, everybody was asked to cover the effects of the earthquake that just happened. So nobody in the newsroom is going to worry about their beats while they're like covering this. Does that make sense? So sometimes those things happen, but it's always good for an editor to understand why and kind of like ask that question. So are there any holes in the story? Like, is there anything that when you get done reading the story that you want to ask, like, well, what about this? Did they even consider this? And that's part of that critical thinking process that a good copy editor needs to go through. You want to ask, does it answer the who, what, when, where, why, how much, why, and why should I care? Right. And if it's not answering these things, then you need to go back to your reporter and say, like, well, what about this? Find out. And it may be that the reporter knows, they just didn't somehow, it didn't make it into the story, and then as a good copy editor, you can easily figure out the best place for that fact to go and add it. Is there enough background? And background is usually what we refer to as context for what you're covering. So let me give you an example of this. Washburn University's mass media department, of which I'm a part, every year does what we call the Wi-Fi Film Festival, which happens in April of every year. And this is its 5th year in Topeka. And so when you were like, if you're sent out to cover a story like this, like, okay, this is an event that's coming up. Obviously, there's going to be, movies that will be shown where we're going to have special featured filmmakers, people that have like done stuff in Hollywood and things like that. And we're going to show a movie at Evergy Plaza, this kind of thing. So that is probably the focus of the story. But at the same time, background would be for the story would be something like, well, how long has this film festival been going on? Why did it even start? Who started it? What did they believe a film festival adds to Topeka? These kinds of contextual things that people like to know. And that for some stories, you may need quite a bit. Like if you're doing a feature story, you will need a lot of background. And we'll cover feature stories a little bit later on. But if you're doing something like a hard news story, like, hey, there was a fire, you probably don't need that much background, but you will still need something like who was there at the scene, who was called, was this building like dangerous, and people just didn't do anything about it, or was this an accident? Like what happened exactly? So the copy editor has to make that judgment, like, is there enough background? And if there's not, then the copy editor will have to go to the journalist and say, like, okay, I need you to, we need a little more facts in this area or that area. Does the story say anything? Can you write a headline without rereading it 3 times? So there should be something that's obviously come out that you're like, okay, this is the headline. And if you can't figure that out, if you can't figure out what the whole main point of it is, the thing that you want to hook people into, it's probably not a very well written story and it probably needs to be redone. Okay, so one thing that copy editors do want to look for is who are the sources in the story. One thing that I think sometimes reporters have trouble with, and I don't believe that this is often intentional. I believe a lot of it happens because um, they are working on a deadline all the time. And so a lot of that is very quick turnaround. And so they may end up quoting the people like over and over and over again in every story because it's easy for them to get access to those people. They have a relationship with them and they can, quickly call up that person and say, like, hey, can I get a quote for you about this thing? Um, that does tend to happen a lot, but a good copy editor will point it out and say, like, you need to get some different sources here. Some people are going to be quoted fairly often, like the mayor of Topeka, right? Any story you write about city government probably is going to involve the mayor. Like, that's just fairly normal. But at the same time, if the mayor is making some new laws for Topeka, you shouldn't only be quoting him and not quoting the people that the laws are affecting, right? Because like we talked about, that's kind of that power differential. You want to know who is affected just as much as you want to know who's doing the affecting. So a good copy editor will often like catch up on that. You want to be careful not to mislead people on the street with, just asking about opinions. So for instance, if you're going, like, let's say Washburn University has decided to increase tuition by $100 per credit hour, which is a lot of money, and that would never happen, thankfully. But it's a lot of money, and it adds up. So if they were going to do that, would the journalist just go out and be like, "Well, what do you think about like, what your education is worth, at Washburn?" And then kind of present the like tuition increase as like, what is it worth to you? That can be a little misleading, right? Instead of just asking them, this thing happened and what can you tell me what you think about it? And then being careful not to just like interview your friends, right? People that are convenient, people that are friendly to you, so they're going to work well with you as a reporter. You can always ask them for a quote. This is some stories it is okay, but it should not be the people you rely on all the time. Sometimes your story, the copy editor may say, you need more voices. Like, you haven't done a good enough job of covering all angles of this story. So one example, and I may have mentioned this before in a previous lecture, but it's a real life example I know of, so I'll talk about it. When I was doing my master's degree at KU, I ended up working with this guy who was a classmate of mine, and he was doing a research project on how the Lawrence Journal World, that newspaper, covered homeless people in Lawrence. And I mean, he was looking like at years of coverage, right? So not just like 1 or 2 newspaper issues. He was like literally going back and doing years and years of research trying to find out all the like stories about homeless people that had been published in the Lawrence Journal World. And one thing that he found was that not in one of those stories had the journalist interviewed somebody who was homeless. Anytime they wanted to talk about the homeless population, they would always talk to people who were in authority, like whether it was like the police, like the city government people, it could be like, rescue personnel or people who work with, homeless, but never did that person actually go, or that journalist actually go and talk to a homeless person. That is a really big problem because as a newspaper, as people who are in news, we're supposed to be getting out the whole side of the whole story, right? It doesn't matter what you agree with or disagree with. That's not the point of the news, right? The point of the news is we're supposed to be like telling people, like, here's what's happening and here's how people feel about it from all aspects of the story, right? So not just the people who are doing the affecting to the homeless people, but the people who are homeless who are being affected. So that's why sometimes, the editor may come back to you and say like, well, okay, I know you said this thing, but you really don't have enough sources in this area and you need to go talk to at least one more person. Is the topic placed in context by including information from an outside or unbiased observer? So a lot of times when you're getting background on things, you do need that third person source. You do need to know what that somebody who is like putting together this context for you is not doing it from the journalist's point of view, but they're giving you somebody, a third person who's saying like, yes, this is what the background says. So and this is especially important if you're writing stories that are very, shall we say, touchy, you need to have people, who are like outside of the whole situation saying like, yeah, this is not an okay thing. And in fact, this brings me, I don't know if you're able to or how the access works for like TV shows, but I would recommend if you have the opportunity to watch the TV show on ABC. It's new this year. It's called Alaska Daily, and it's got Hillary Swank in it, and it's all about like the stories that she writes that often, and the other people at the newspaper write, that will often ruffle feathers. And how the editor will say like, you need to go get more sources, or you don't have enough. And copy editors are really important to this because they're the ones that see it day to day. So it's really important as a copy editor that you kind of look for this. And if they don't have these outside sources, you tell them to go get some. Did I go past a slide here? Because I can't tell. Yes. Okay. I guess it went really fast. So is there another side to the story? Like we talked about the homeless people, that's something you need to ask. And then when there's an accusation raised, so somebody did something wrong or somebody made a decision that other people don't like or that people do like, either one, does the target have the opportunity to respond? So we wouldn't publish a story about a public figure without saying, sending the journalist to ask that public figure for comment. Now, the public figure absolutely has the right to say no comment, and they very well may. And if they do say no comment, a lot of times you'll see it in the newspaper where they say, source, we reached out to sources from the mayor's office, but they declined to comment. And that says something in itself, right? That also says that, yeah, they know they're probably in trouble and they they don't want to talk about it. I see that a lot in news stories because especially if somebody's been accused of doing something kind of, crazy, a lot of times the lawyers will say, don't talk, which is not bad legal advice, but a public relations person would say, like, you need to draft up some kind of statement saying something like, we don't know all the facts yet. And, we're pursuing this matter like as quickly as we can, something like that. Right. Instead of just saying no comment, because everybody knows no comment makes you look guilty. Okay, so are racial, sexual, religious, or ethnic references relevant? So first of all, do any of these things belong in a story? Okay. Obviously, you can't write a book about how a school district wants to ban the book How to Kill a Mockingbird because of racial overtones in the story without mentioning race, right? In that story, it would absolutely be, appropriate. But consider this, when you're writing about somebody who robbed a convenience store, is it appropriate for you to say like, oh yeah, it was this Hispanic person, and we all know that Hispanic people are always, gangsters? Like, no, your copy editor would be like, what? Because even if you don't say explicitly that we think that, Hispanic people are gangsters, especially men, right? It's going to be in the minds of people who are reading the story. So a good copy editor would be like, what is the point of putting this person's race in this story? Like, all we're going to talk about is the fact that they did something. We don't need to like talk about, any kind of explanation as to why they did it or anything like that. But in the case of like How to Kill a Mockingbird, yes, race is absolutely relevant because the school district wants to ban the book. So in that case, like you would say like, okay, but are they applied equally? Right. So yes, it does belong in the story, but are we talking about the school district banning the book because it talks about race and it's a bunch of white people who are doing it? Because, it needs to be equal, right? You don't want to just talk about one racial group if there's another one involved and you ignore that one completely. Does that make sense? So we want to make sure that everything is equal because we want to be most objective. Are there too many quotes? This is one that journalists often struggle with because they get a lot of quotes, and sometimes you feel like, oh, I have to include every quote. You don't. Um, Paraphrases are actually probably the bread and butter of most, I would say, journalists. So a good copy editor will look and be like, this is a little too much on the quoting. Like, let's paraphrase, right? Um, and then the one quote that you think like, oh, as a journalist, like this is the best quote ever. It makes the whole story. Like the good copy editor will say like, well, do we really need this? Is it really as important to the story as the journalist believes it is? I mean, it might be, but it also might not be. And if it's not, a good copy editor will say like, no, let's nix this. Do the quotes have their own agenda? So, for instance, is the quote making fun of somebody? It's like, the mayor said something nasty about the governor. Well, do we need to really include that? In fact, so I'll tell you kind of a funny story. I had a student a few years ago, so she's been graduated for a while now, but she wrote this story about, I think it's the chocolate after dark event that like downtown Topeka had been putting on for a couple of years, where you get together and you invite like local vendors and they do this like chocolate, like beer and wine and like food tasting and stuff. And she interviewed a lady who attended as a guest, like, paid for the ticket and went. And the lady said something like, in the quote she included, she said something like, unfortunately, we are expecting our second child. So I'm really glad they had chocolate here tonight, or something like that. And I was like, okay, but do we really want to include the word unfortunately? Because it makes them sound like horrible parents, right? And probably the lady who was interviewed didn't mean it that way. She probably didn't mean it like, oh, this is the worst news of my life, I'm pregnant again. She probably just meant like, I can't do a lot of things because I'm pregnant now. So this is something that I can enjoy, so it's one of those things where you have to kind of consider, like, as an outsider reading that story, what would you think about that if you read the unfortunately comment, right? So that's something to keep in mind. Are the quotes from email, and does it read like it's from an email? Sometimes, and it's very rare, but there will be some instances where you have to get a quote over email. Like, so for instance, let's say you are in the United States, but you're supposed to be interviewing a National Guard member who is in Afghanistan doing a tour right now, but he's from Fort Riley. Well, you can't just make a trip to Afghanistan, probably. Some people can, but most people can't, right? And interview this person. So what you would probably do then is have to do some kind of Skype or Zoom call, and then probably follow up with an email. And he might have to send you quotes through email, because usually anybody who's on active duty has to go through their public information officers, right? So they probably would have to approve or disapprove the quotes and that kind of thing. So you might have to be forced in that instance to get a quote from email. But there's no excuse for getting quotes from email if you're like here in town and able to actually drive over there and like interview them, right? This is for more cases where access is limited. So if you do get a quote from an email, that is okay in certain instances, but does it read like it's out of an email? And in that case, like, it needs to be changed. Okay, so the lead is the first. We've talked about this many, many times, right? Our first sentence in our story. The way she's so this is not my original PowerPoint. I've made some changes to it, but I think her name is Catherine. It's on the first slide. She spells lead LEDE because that's actually how you spell it when you're talking about the lead in a physical newspaper. It's a printing term. We pretty well call it lead as an LEAD anymore, because printing is not really that important to news anymore. Most people are publishing online rather than in hard copy all the time. So just in case you're confused about that. Okay, so a lead is also called a nut graph when it comes to feature stories. And we'll talk about that later on when we actually get to the feature story section. So is the beginning of the story inviting, right? Remember that it's not news that like a meeting or an event was held. Like, everybody knows that's happening. So the lead shouldn't just be like, an event was held at this time and this day. You really want to be like, well, what happened at the event that was like, very exciting. And my one of my old professors used to tell me it's the Hey Martha test. So if you went somewhere, let's say you went to a concert, you came home, and you were like, hey, Martha, guess what happened? What would you say about the concert? You wouldn't be like, hey, there was a concert at Wednesday night at 8 p.m., at the Sprint Center. Like, that's not the news. And that's not what you'd say when start with that, hey, Martha, right? You would say like, hey, Martha, guess what happened? There was a crazy drunk guy and he like fell off the stage. And like, this is the event itself is like, okay, yes, we know it's happening, but like what happened at the event that makes it exciting and interesting? Does the inviting intro fit the point of the story? So again, we want to make sure that our lead is connecting really well with where's the story going, right? What are you trying to take us on and show us? If the lead is anecdotal, which does happen in feature writing more often, won't happen it will not happen in hard news stories, but in feature writing, yes. So an anecdotal lead means kind of like a quote could be, or like a little story from that illustrates a point, right? And it could be from the main source of the story. Like a lot of times you'll see that in feature stories. So if it is that, like, then that means you're not giving the who, what, when, where, why, and how, right? Because it's anecdotal. So is there a nut graph? And usually in a feature story, the nut graph will be like the second, maybe third paragraph. And so, could be there. Okay, is the first paragraph easy to understand, right? In a hard news story, could you write a headline based on the lead? If you cannot, that means the lead needs to be fixed. Too much information in the sentence, sometimes, again, remember, we have to keep our lead short. And that's why we have what we call the bridge or the secondary lead. So sometimes, like, journalists have a little bit of trouble getting that lead, like, concise. And a good copy editor will come in and just say, like, let's put this in the secondary lead. Doubts about the lead. Oh my gosh, I cannot tell you how many times I have found a buried lead in students' papers. It seems like students will often introduce a story and like which we don't need in news writing. And by like the third paragraph, that's usually the one that I'm like, here's the lead. So I'll just usually delete the first two and be like, here's the lead. Because, then they finally get to the whole point of everything. But a good editor will pay attention to that and find it. Okay, that's not supposed to be in there. I was supposed to delete that, but apparently I didn't. Anyways, it's just an example of a story. Okay, so the rest of the story. So is the information where readers want to find it, right? Or are there important details left to the end? Remember, if we're talking about inverted pyramid style, we want the important information from top to bottom, right? So most important at the top, least important at the bottom. A good editor will check for this and make sure that they pull up anything important to the top. If it is too long, thinking about like some stories don't need to be that long, right? Especially if they're in online publications like newsletters, you really don't need anything more than 300 words. But as writers, we tend to want to write and write and write, and sometimes that's not doing you a service. So a good editor will be like, nope, it's too long. People are not going to read this. Does every paragraph actually contribute to the story? Like, is there too much information so you could like cut out a paragraph or two? And you probably have seen that I've done this to some of your papers, especially when it comes to the fire story that we did. I'll just cut out whole paragraphs because I'm like, what's the point of this? It doesn't fit and it doesn't matter. And then does the ending kind of connect or fit with the beginning? Okay, so tone and style is really important. You want to, in news writing, you want to be short, familiar, and very specific, right? We want details. You do not want to attempt to sound intellectual by using everybody's jargon, right? Or these big words. That's not the point of news writing, because you have to remember that the average American, and this is average, right? So taking the highs and the lows, put them together, the average American has an 8th grade education. Being too wordy or having too much jargon is going to just turn your reader off. So a good editor will mark that out. Does the tone fit the subject matter? Like, are you writing a story about a funeral, but you're trying to make it humorous? Well, there could be a rare case where that's okay, but most of the time it's probably not going to be. So you want the tone to be consistent. If you're writing about something really tragic, you want to be in a very serious voice. If you're writing something very funny, like the three-headed chicken, you want to write in a, maybe more humorous tone. Grammar is very, very important. We can always change the style depending on where you work, because, for instance, you might use AP style, but you might also end up using something else, like from the Yahoo style guide. Every organization kind of has their own thing. You can always change the style, But what you cannot fix easily is the grammar. And so as a journalist, they have to get it right. And as a copy editor, you have to get it right, because this is like the thing that everybody will point out and be like, look, they missed their apostrophe. It's in the wrong place. And then it looks really bad for the reputation of the organization and the journalists. Too many adjectives because the nouns and verbs aren't more specific. You really want to hone in on strong subject, strong verb, right? And remember, we've talked about cutting out extra words that push the verb back farther in the sentence. So I think one of the examples from our grammar lecture was, there are 5 stages of grief, when you could simply say the 5 stages of grief are, right? Like right to that strong subject. We don't need to push it back. So again, keep in mind these types of things, and a good copy editor will look for this. And then they'll look to see, like, is the background information present where it needs to be? So if you're talking about something specifically like the mayor, raising parking tickets, is the background information really close to that part of the story, so that people can understand, like, well, they were this and now they're this, and that's why they were there. Some really important things that both journalists and editors should do is always double check proper names. And my favorite thing is just to look it up, because even if you think it's just best to always double check it and look it up. Claims of distinction, like, oh, he was the first president of the company, double check that that's really true and that there wasn't somebody else, there. Make sure the math is correct, because you'll be surprised at how many journalists will sometimes get these things mixed up or wrong. So is it, obviously between millions and billions, that's a huge difference. And then are percentages figured correctly? Look for typos early and often, misspellings, duplicated words. On deadline, check at least the first and the last graphs where most of the mistakes are. So if you're running behind, which does happen in the newsroom if you're trying to do a lot of things, really you need to make sure that first and the last paragraphs are the best. And if you see something, mark it immediately, because you probably won't remember it later. I'll tell you that off the top of my head. And that's why most copy editors will edit on actual physical paper and not on a computer screen, because when you print it off, there's something about the way the mind works that when you print it off and you can actually write things down physically, your editing is so much better. And when your reputation is riding on this, like, it's just really important. Oh, so this is just a funny copy editor thing. For there are specific marks, but I don't use them. I just mark them out and write my corrections above. So for online corrections, because now we're in a time where almost every organization has an online space to publish stories, you want to correct your online errors immediately. Do not wait, because trust me, you'll get lots of hate mail. Well, not so much hate mail, but lots of comments like, you spelled their name wrong, and you don't want to do that. So here's an example, right? An earlier version of this article misspelled the surname of Lamar's vice principal. So if you, as the editor, are going to insert the to fix it, you might say something like, because of an editing error, sorry, an earlier version of this article misspelled the surname of Lamar's vice principal. And then online corrections, you don't need to repeat the error. You can just change it, because it's online. You have access to change it at any time. But in printed things, you will probably have to insert the story. And this I've seen actually fairly often. Like if you read a story and it's maybe 5 days old, you might see at the bottom something like an earlier version of the story said this, but we have now changed it to this, and the online story will read the correct way. So here's an example, right? An earlier version of this article misspelled Zachary Corp and Capital Aggregates Ltd. I mean, just very, very simple, right? So it's at the bottom for online stuff, you will see that. Okay, so print corrections usually have to be corrected by the next publication, and usually you will repeat the mistake and then add the correction. And you might say like she said here, in the last issue, the page 4 article about temporary classrooms misspelled the surname of Lamar's vice principal. His name is Bobby Reynolds, not Reynoso. So just very simple. But people who read the paper, tend to read the paper every day, and so they'll probably catch this. Only correct typos that cause factual errors. So if they misspelled the word the, just ignore that. It's only when it's factual stuff that you actually have to care about it. Okay, so that's all for the copy editing lecture. I know this one's a little bit longer, but copy editing is absolutely what I would consider to be a very detailed type of subject and takes a lot of work. And so if you're interested in something like this, like there are always organizations out there that want copy editors who are really good. And you can definitely do some online training for it and other things, you know, get certificates in it and these kinds of things. So just kind of keep that at the back of your mind. Like it is always a potential. All right. Thank you guys. And I will talk to you later.